Thank you. Welcome to Dubbo, and for those of you that are not from this part of New South Wales or this part of the world, I'm just going to start by giving you a little bit of an introduction to the area and some of my work with the Central West Catchment Management Authority. So the Central West Catchment covers the catchments of 3 rivers that are part of the Murray-Darling Basin, the Castlereagh, the Macquarie and the Bogan. It's a pretty large and diverse area, and it covers about 11% of New South Wales. It's got a great diversity of environments, everything from subalpine to semi-arid rangelands, a great diversity of agricultural production, a great diversity of Aboriginal and European cultural heritage, a diverse range of towns and cities with a total population of about 200,000, and a diverse range of challenges and opportunities. Now, diversity is a fantastic thing, but it does create complexity when we start to think about improving our communities and our natural resources and the links between them. And that's what I'm going to focus on today, really some different ways of looking at the challenges of managing our natural resources and how we can put people and community at the centre of our decisions in this important area. So resolving natural resource management issues is the reason why the Central West Catchment Management Authority exists. Our goal is to improve natural resources, our land, our water, our biodiversity and our soils. But our work is as much about the people as it is about the resource base. And our vision, vibrant communities and healthy landscapes, with community deliberately first, encapsulates this. Everything we do in partnership. And if we really want healthy landscapes, then we think we need to have that we need to ensure that we've got engaged and vibrant communities in that. So turning it on to discussing natural resource management. Now in the past, and our previous speaker just covered off on some of this, natural resource management people tended to make some common assumptions. 3 key ones were that all our systems are linear, and that is if we're unhappy with the system, we can just continually tweak one variable and eventually it'll be fixed and we'll be happy. Secondly, that we're always right. There's a few things going on here. Sometimes we're just too focused on the hard science, and we don't look at knowledge diversity, which holds that some local knowledge can be just as valid as what we see in a scientific journal. We also tend to think that we have all the solutions, rather than testing to see if we might in fact be doing the wrong thing. And thirdly, that people are outside the natural system. That is, that we're directing the traffic and not part of it. Now, none of these things are actually true. Most systems are not linear. We don't always know what to do, and our environmental, social and economic systems are linked in very complex ways. In fact, our natural systems are complex, they're multidimensional, they're constantly changing, and they're often chaotic. So just to illustrate that, I thought you'll have to indulge me using a few slides of cycling, but given Cadel Evans's win in the Tour de France, I thought I should use a few of those images. So we tend to think that natural resource management works this way. You know, all these guys here, they're more or less operating in linear fashion, and there's a sense of balance, harmony and order in that chaos of the peloton. But it's not always the way we think. And sometimes when we think we're in control, we can quickly be surprised. And the reality of natural resource management is that it looks something like this. It's complex, chaotic, with lots of influences and lots of players. And even with a small family, that's how my kitchen feels some mornings. So it's a really interesting, difficult, complex system. And a lot of our natural resource management problems exist today, not because we haven't done a lot of work trying to solve them, because we certainly have, but because we've been looking at things the wrong way. I'll just use a few examples to show how easy it is to get things wrong. So, away from the Central West, you'd all know this slide. It's the Barrier Reef, one of the great natural wonders of the world. But we know that some parts of it are turning into this. And why? Well, because we've been applying the same simple, linear, technocentric approach to fix complex problems. Closer to home, how easy do you think it is to turn a productive agricultural landscape like this into a salt-impacted landscape like this, or possibly even into this. Now, some of you might have seen that image because we've used it a little bit, and that's actually a paddock near Orange, so it's not too far away from here. And believe it or not, only a few decades ago, that won Best District Wheat Crop Prize several years running. They're using a linear technologically centred approach. We just applied more fertiliser and more tillage to sort out the problem, and obviously that didn't work. So again, in our part of the world, it's actually not that hard to turn a productive rural watercourse like this into this. And if we look at some of our economic and social statistics, it may not in fact be all that hard to turn this into this. So what do we want to do about it? Well, of course, most of you would know the quote from Einstein that we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. And the Central West community is actually now thinking very differently about natural resource management. And one of the key things is that we're serious about a shift from thinking about sustainability to thinking about resilience, which is significantly different. And I guess the simple definition of resilience is it's about the ability of a system to respond to some sort of shock and to operate in more or less the same way. Now, I guess you probably all had a quote, "She's a really resilient child," and you probably don't need to think about it in much more differently than that. I mean, that's a simple definition, and that works. Resilience lets us look at the way complex and linked environmental, social and economic systems work. It works to define thresholds, which, when crossed, are difficult if not impossible to return from, and we call this the safe operating space for a system. Resilience lets us get clear about how systems respond to shocks like drought, commodity prices and climate change, and it allows us to plan for those. Resilience also accepts that there are limits to how much a system can change and recover. If we think of the bleached coral or the saline landscape or the eroded soils that I showed earlier, they've clearly crossed a threshold. Getting them back to what they were is impossible. We pushed them too hard, we ran them as linear systems, and in a relatively short time, unfortunately, they were across a threshold. Another really important point to note about those earlier slides is that whilst the damage might look like it's just environmental, in the last slide you can see that in fact can be damage to a linked environmental, economic and social system. Just moving on to this last slide, we've got some systems to show how things work from a resilience perspective. Now, in the first one, you can see that there's basically a straight line. So it's a simple linear system and you can move backwards and forwards. Don't worry too much about the variables, it's really not important. It's the lines, the curves that are important. Now, in the second one, you've got a step change, you've got a system functioning, and then for whatever reason, quite quickly we move up into another threshold. Now, the line is continuous, so it is actually potentially possible to move back to the earlier state, but to get there requires a lot of energy, a lot of resources, and often that's not actually possible to do. In the third slide, we've crossed from one threshold to an alternate stable state. Now, the stable state could be good, but often it's not desirable. It's things that we don't want. And again, potentially with a lot of effort, you may be able to get back to your earlier state. And in the last graph there, you've got an irreversible threshold change. So there's no chance at all that you can get back to some of your earlier situations. Now, of course, to avoid crossing those thresholds, to manage our systems effectively, we need to identify what the thresholds are, and we need to specifically manage to stay away from them. We want to invest in systems that can bounce around in that safe operating space when they're subject to shocks and still function well. We must be clear about not trying to get some systems back into a state into which they can never go. And lastly, we want to be clear about those systems that might be beyond repair. So that's a pretty challenging thing to do in the context of our natural environment and the linked social and economic system. But I'm happy to say that the Central West community and the Central West CMA has actually done all of this. And we've done it in a new 10-year catchment action plan. It's a plan that was built from the bottom up. was genuinely community driven, and it's a regional plan that we hope inspires action based on linked environmental, economic and social systems. It is dynamic, it recognises natural and social variability, and it works at a range of scales, we hope from local properties, regional, state and national. It has targets that are about identifying and managing within system limits. It's evidence-based, but that means it's not just hard science, it's also community input. So we've got a real knowledge diversity in the plan, and it's community owned. We actually call it a whole of community plan. We've had lots of our local interest groups sponsoring sessions where we've delivered information about the Catchment Action Plan, and we've even had some of those interest groups actually issuing media releases supporting the plan. And I think that's an interesting contrast when you've got what is in effect the government-sponsored plan dealing with complex natural resource management issues, and you've got the community actually coming out and saying, fantastic work, we like what you're doing. Now, the resilience experts tell us that this is the first time such an advanced resilience-based plan has been developed at the regional level. So I think that's a great thing for the Central West. It's a great thing at a forum like this to actually think that, you know, the regional communities can do this sort of thing that can actually lead the world. But more importantly, and with my work, it's all about the region, and this will help us solve some very complex regional issues. It has delivered a huge change in our thinking, and this will deliver a huge change in our natural resource base over time. And given the theme of today, I think that's something that we should all aspire to. So I guess in terms of your work from here, I guess the challenge for many people working in this space is to actually get clear about bringing the community forward in dealing with some of our complex natural resource management issues. We think you can do it. There's some really good lessons from this part of the world which we're really happy to share, and we'll certainly do that going forward. Thanks, David.